Hello and welcome to session 2 of the Empower Your Wellbeing course. To begin, it is the perfect opportunity to give yourself a little moment to reflect from our first session. Taking your pen and a piece of paper, or maybe having a consider inside, but it is nice to make notes. What is it that's been different in your relationship with food, your body and yourself since that first session? Now, often in our culture, it's very normal to focus on what we didn't do, what wasn't perfect, what wasn't right, what went wrong, blah, blah, blah. And what I'm inviting you to do here is to notice the inspiration from the last session. Water, fruit, being aware of your food talk, asking what you might want instead, having that critical lens of noticing the identity, noticing the value. What is it they're really selling? And just to make some notes now, what is it that's been working for you? What is it that you've been noticing? What is it that has been different? Even if you haven't made any specific changes, but you have been more aware of things, that is an incredible step on the journey of empowered wellbeing. If we could do it simply overnight, then I wouldn't be making this 6-week course. This is here to support you on the journey. And in order to do that, we need to be noticing where it is working for us. So take that time now, be generous with yourself, and just make a few little notes, just a little something of like, okay, what has landed? What has worked? What has been different? And then we'll dive into this week's session. This session is one of my favourite sessions because it's all about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates is an area of nutrition that everyone knows a little bit of something about, that we get an incredible amount of confusing messages around, especially around, are carbs good, are carbs bad, should I be eating them, should I not? And it can be so confusing. And whenever we have confusion, then we have doubt. And wherever we have doubt, we have the opportunity to spend lots and lots of our mental energy worrying about it, trying to get it right, comparing ourselves to other people. And it just goes on and on. So as our foundation within this session, within carbohydrates, we need to work with our first tool within food talk. And this is to move toward what it means to have empowered language. Now, empowered language can be to do with the language we speak out in the world, but empowered language is also to do with what is it we're saying inside, how is it we're speaking to ourselves. Now, there is what I would describe as pseudo-empowered language that happens in our society around food, and this is especially around that I deserve it and treat yourself, all these kind of things. They sound like they're empowered. However, what we're really doing is following a rhetoric from a food industry that wants us to buy their stuff, from the perspective that we are doing something good for ourselves and maybe being a little bit sassy and independent if we maybe indulge or overspend or buy something that we know actively harms our health. So this is pseudo-empowerment. What we're looking at here is true empowerment, where it's about your own informed, flexible choice in that moment. And it's like, does it serve you? That's how you'll know if it's an empowered choice. It's like, does this really meet my needs and make me feel good right here, right now? And when I look back on this choice, will it continue to make me feel good? Now, the language of empowered choice can be very, very subtle, and it's important to find a way of bringing it into the present and into the here and into the now. The opposite of empowered language is when we say, I can't have that, or I'm not allowed that. When we say I can't have, or I'm not allowed, there's this very subtle ever again at the end of that sentence. Or I'm not allowed to eat that ever. Or I can't have that ever. And when we have this subtle never ever again, it can feel very heavy, it can put pressure on us, it can make us feel stressed, and it can make us actually want to do the thing or to treat ourselves or say I deserve it. And this is where that whole game and story and play can unravel. What we're looking at here is bringing ourselves into the present and saying, well, what is it I would like to choose now? What is it I would like to say yes to or say no to? In this session, we'll be talking a lot about sugar. And sugar can be a place where we have patterns of addiction, patterns of habit, patterns of craving, and it can be a space where we are the most hard on ourselves. Now, once we got to the end of this session, I'll be inviting you to take 3 days to experience your life and your body and yourself without having any sugar. And I'm not talking about the nourishing, wholesome sugars of fruit, but the more refined and processed sugars. And we'll get clarity on this as we go through. We need empowered language for those 3 days, because if you spend those 3 days saying, I'm on this course, so I'm not allowed to eat that because Elle said, I don't mind. Please do what you want. It's really important. What we need in those 3 days is this curiosity and this empowerment to say, okay, I'm going to choose to find out what it's like to be me without having this sugar coming into my body. And I'm going to find out what it's like to have something else instead. So we might be saying things like, today I'm seeing what it's like to have fruit instead of that thing. Or if someone offers us something, we can just say, no, I'm going to have this instead. We don't have to go into the whole story. I'm not allowed that. I can't. Because we can. Of course you can. With empowered language, we're bringing it into what is actually meaningful for us in that moment and that choice there and then. So we might say things like, today I'm trying. I'm curious too. Yes, I do want that. No, I don't want that. So it's got a clarity to it. It's got a simplicity to it. And we're really finding out, what is it that's going on in that moment. Within empowered language, we can absolutely acknowledge that maybe there's a part of us that does want to say yes. So if I was, say, for example, 2 days into having no sugar and I go to a friend's house and they've baked something, I might be in that situation where I'm like, okay, well, do I want to say yes to this? Part of empowerment is saying yes when it feels good for us. I might say to that friend, what, I've been doing this no sugar thing and I'm going to see how it feels. So this time I'm going to say no and thank you so much for making that and wanting to share it with me. Or I might say, I'm 2 days into this no sugar thing. I'll have a bit and see how I feel. Because it's just as interesting to notice what it is that's going on for us as a point of inquiry as it is to have some sort of dogma or rule and just say no, no, no. So empowered language is your choice, and it is your space to find out a little bit more about what is it you would like to actually choose in that moment. So try it on now. Maybe remember a time where you've had some of this, will I, won't I, should I, shouldn't I, can I, can't I. Maybe you've been with a friend in a cafe where they've gone, go on, shall we be naughty? Shall we have a cake? Shall we have a this? What would it be like just to have that sense of sovereignty of do I want it or not? Well, today I'd like it, or today I don't want that. Right now, I'll have a little bit. Right now, I'm okay, thanks. Right now, I'll have this instead. And just see what it feels like in your body, in yourself, to experiment with this kind of empowered language. At first, it can feel a bit unfamiliar, but it will become more familiar as we work with it, and we can get a deeper connection to what's actually true for us. So here is your first gift, your first tool for this session of empowered language. So throughout this course, we're going to be deep diving the different macronutrients. Macro simply means large amount, and nutrient is this resource for the body. So the macronutrients are the nutrients, are the resources for the body that we need in the bigger amounts. And there's 3 of those. There's carbohydrates, there's fats, and there's proteins. So let's first look at carbohydrates. When we talk about carbohydrates, we're speaking about certain foods that contain different types of sugars, starch, and fiber. These 3 things each play a different role in the body that we'll inspect further. And the important part to know is that the sugars and the starch that come into the body provide us with the perfect energy source. The thing that gives us the vitality, the ability to concentrate. It feeds us. It's our absolute perfect fuel to give us the ability to focus and to move and to do all the things in life that we might want to do with our lovely bodies and our lovely lives. So when we're eating carbohydrates, they're absolutely fundamentally essential for how we feel. When we talk about the brain as an example, the brain uses 20% of the energy that we consume in a day. And if we don't consume carbohydrate, then the brain can cope, but it is really in a survival mode. This is the brain and the body's and the muscles' fuel of preference. So we're eating carbohydrates in order to give us the energy for our focus and everything we want to be able to do. So they're pretty important. Now, when we talk about carbohydrates, there's this idea of carbohydrates being good or being bad. And what it comes down to is the different type of carbohydrates that we can eat. And we can essentially eat them of two different forms. One, we might call them whole food. And what this means is that they have been minimally processed. So they still contain a combination of sugar, starch and fibre. Whereas then we have here the much more processed versions, and this can include things like sugar, syrup and flour. Whereas in the whole food side of things, we might have things like grains. So within the world of carbohydrate, what we want to understand is, well, what's actually going on in the body when we eat this, and how can we support ourselves to have the best energy and the best focus to really serve us throughout the day. So when we eat a carbohydrate, what's coming into the body is one of each of these three things. We've got our starch, we've got our fibre, I'll put fibre in green, and we've got our sugars, which I'll put in orange. Okay, so we eat a carbohydrate and we have obviously the taste sensations and the enjoyable eating time, but then really this true dance of the nutrition begins once we swallow and it comes down into our esophagus, into the stomach, and from the stomach down into the intestinal tract. Now, what is the role of the stomach? Say I was to eat some grain, say I ate some rice or something like that, then I eat the rice, I chew it up, it comes down into my stomach, and my body can't use rice. They have to be broken down into these different nutrient forms, either as starch, fibre or sugars. So this is the stomach's role. The stomach is able to separate from it being a food to being individual nutrients. I think of it as like the karate chopper, it's able to break things down in a really useful way. Then we've got our intestinal tract, and the intestinal tract is where the nutrients go, and what the intestinal tract wants to do is to pass the nutrients into the blood. That's what the intestinal tract has been doing for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of human bodies existing. So here it passes the nutrients to the blood, and from the blood, this is our inner delivery system. Your blood is pulsing and rushing and spiraling around your body right now, delivering all the different things that need to be delivered. So it's taking oxygen, it's taking different amino acids, it's taking fuel. So it's allowing you to function, keep alive, and have the healing and repair tools that you need. And it's all happening through this digestive process, which is really incredibly intelligent. Now, when we look at this system hasn't changed for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. However, our food culture and the things that we call food and the different products now available have changed humongously. So we have these different products moving through the same system. So this is what we're going to look at in this first session. When we eat a carbohydrate, it contains starch, it contains fibre, and it contains sugars. What is starch? Starch is individual molecules of something called glucose. Glucose is a type of sugar, and when these molecules are bound together in different strings, they form starch. There's lots of different forms of starch, but they're essentially glucose in different lengths of string. Over here we've got our sugars. Glucose is one of those sugars. Anything that ends in ose is a type of sugar. So that could include maltose, dextrose, sucralose. If you're ever looking at an ingredient label and something has the word ose on the end, something ends in ose, then you know that that is a type of sugar. So we've got our starch, we've got our sugars, and what's this thing, fibre? Now you may have noticed if you've ever sliced a tomato or a lettuce or a courgette, that it has a specific structure to its form. A courgette looks different to a lettuce, looks different to a tomato. However, they don't have any bones. You probably noticed that. Whereas if you had a chicken or a fish, then there's bones inside. So fibre, I think of as being the bones of plants. They allow the plants, fruits, vegetables, herbs, spices, beans, grains, you name it. They allow these different plants to have the specific structure they have. So all plants contain fibre. Fibre is never found in animal products or dairy or eggs or meat or anything like that. They're only found inside plants because it's the structure of their plant body. Fibre is not necessarily a nutrient. It doesn't pass into our blood and go around the body and be delivered to where it's needed, but it plays a completely essential role down in our digestive process and in the digestive tract. We'll look at part of it today, and we'll also look at part of that in the 5th session on the gut microbiome. So fibre comes in 2 forms. We have sticky fibre, and it absorbs water, and we have scratchy fibre. It doesn't absorb water. You'll see this if you've ever soaked oats. You put oats and water in a bowl. If you come back half an hour later, it will have gone quite sticky. Whereas if you'd left some carrots stood in some water and came back half an hour later, they don't go sticky. That's because the oats have the soluble fibre that absorbs the water and goes sticky. And carrots have more of this insoluble fibre that doesn't go sticky, it stays scratchy. So we've got sticky and we've got scratchy. Now in the world of sugars, it's really good to clarify between 2 different things. I would say that we have the natural sugars, and they are bound inside different fruits, vegetables and grains. So when we eat an orange, for example, it is sweet because it contains sugars. However, it's bound inside the fruit. Whereas then we have what we might call the free sugars, and these have usually been extracted or processed in some way and removed and no longer bound inside that original fruit, vegetable or grain. This can include syrup, this can include honey, this can include sugar like the kind of table sugar or the different sugars that we bake with, and this can include juice as well. So when we see things sweetened with fruit juice, that's just the sugar and the water taken out of a fruit, so it's still a refined and extracted processed sugar. So I'll put here free sugars and refined sugars. These 2 types of sugar, these forms of sugar, whether it's free or whether it's bound, behave very differently in the body, and we'll come to speak about how these impact the brain shortly. For now, let's take a little example of looking inside the body when we eat a carbohydrate that has different amounts of these things in. So a great example to do this with is a cracker. So we're going to take the example of a rye cracker. A popular brand of rye cracker that you might know of is Rye Vita, but you can get own brand versions as well in different shops. Now a rye cracker, if you've ever looked at one, you can see that they've still got some of the husk of the actual rye in it. So they've got this kind of like rough texture. This shows us that the rye cracker contains starch and also contains fibre. So if you were to imagine this rye cracker coming down through the digestive tract, what would happen is we'd have the tastes, maybe all the textures and the niceness, whatever it was we put on our crackers, and then we chew it up, nom nom nom, and down into our stomach we start to have strings of starch. And the strings of starch are there. And along with that string of starch, we also have fibres, which come down into the stomach. And our stomach's job is to break the bonds, to separate these up into nutrients and things that the body can use. So the starch strings break into individual molecules of glucose. So down into this intestinal tract, we get individual molecules of glucose coming in. Very useful because the body can use those for its preferred source of energy. So down comes the glucose, and then the fibre either gets sticky, absorbs a bit of water, or stays scratchy, and this comes down into the intestinal tract with the glucose. So we eat the cracker, the nutrients come into the body, the stomach separates them and it passes them to the intestinal tract, and now the intestinal tract wants to do the job it's done for thousands and thousands of years, and it wants to get those nutrients into the blood. So let's have a little sneaky peek inside our bloodstream at this moment. So if we were to look inside our blood at 3 different points in time, what we might see is this. Say we start off and we're feeling hungry. We're feeling hungry because we have a low level of glucose, sugar, available to our blood, and we feel hungry because our body is saying, hey, I need more energy. Maybe we get a mental slump, maybe we get a physical slump to be able to support us. So we eat something. Great. So we're hungry, we eat the thing, and then what starts happening is that the intestinal tract starts passing the glucose into the blood. And the fascinating thing is, the fibre here plays a major role in this. I'd like you to imagine if you've ever seen a group of teenagers trying to get into a nightclub with a bouncer on the door. The glucose is like this. The glucose is like the screaming teenagers, and they want to get into the nightclub, like the glucose wants to get into the blood. But the fibre is there, and it's sticky, and it's scratchy, and it's sludgy, and it's like the bouncer on the door saying, one at a time, please, one at a time. So because the presence of fibre is there, what happens is that this glucose comes into the blood bit by bit and is taken to where it's needed and used. And this keeps happening for, well, depending on how much we ate, but anywhere from 1 to 4 hours, depending on what we ate or how much we ate. So this slow, steady release of glucose coming into the blood allows us to experience something a little bit like this. We feel full. We feel satisfied. We're not craving for more things to eat. We feel energized, so we're able to focus and move and do the things that we want. And this is all happening because the fibre is present. The fibre is there slowing the passing of the glucose coming into the blood, so we get this slow, steady release of energy, so we feel good and we're able to continue doing what it is that's important to us. And then however long after, depending on whether you ate a snack or whether it was a meal or how much fibre was in it, we will then find that we come to a natural level of returning to a lower level of sugar in the blood, of blood glucose. And then one of two things happens. Either we signal again that we're hungry, maybe it's our midday meal or our evening meal, or we start to enter our sleep cycle. And this is a really, really natural process. So this is what happens when we eat a form of carbohydrate that has a good level of fibre in it. We're going to be looking at a specific tool you can use to find out if something does have a good level of fibre in it, to allow this full, satisfied, energised and focused phenomena to happen naturally inside the body. Now what's interesting is to find out, well, what happens when it's not like this? Say, for example, we were to eat a different type of cracker, and say this time we were to eat something like a wheat cracker that's been maybe a bit more refined and processed. So for example, like a Jacob's cracker could be a good example of this. So this wheat cracker is very likely made from white flour, and white flour has had nearly all of the fibre removed. So this wheat cracker is actually just predominantly starch. So what happens this time, if we imagine we eat the wheat cracker, it comes down into our stomach. This time there's no fibre present, so none of that fibre will be there. So then this time the stomach just has to focus on breaking the starch. So the stomach does what it's always done, and it separates the starch into individual molecules of glucose. It passes those individual molecules of glucose down into the intestinal tract. And the intestinal tract does what it's always done and tries to pass those nutrients to the blood. But this time there's no fibre present. So let's look inside what actually happens differently inside the blood this time. So say we start off in the exact same place as before. We're feeling hungry and we're getting that signal for hunger because we have a low amount of glucose in our blood. We don't have a lot of energy available to us. So then we decide to eat something, and what happens is this: we eat the cracker, the starch gets broken down in the stomach, it comes down into the intestinal tract, and then all those molecules of glucose, remember those screaming teenagers trying to get in a nightclub, but this time there's no bouncer, there's no fibre to slow things down. So what happens is, if we look in the blood, rushing in all at once comes all the glucose. And this can happen very quickly. This can happen between 30 minutes and 1 hour. But the thing is, after that time is over, there's no more glucose being released to the body. So within 30 minutes to 1 hour, we're actually back here, maybe feeling hungry. But what happens within that time is this. When we have a high amount of glucose in our blood, this is a high blood sugar level, and this is actually dangerous for the body. Having a high amount of sugar in our blood can cause damage to the blood vessels behind our eyes. Blood vessels in other areas of the body can cause damage to our organs. So the body goes into absolute panic mode and says, how am I going to get this glucose out of the system? Now, we might see this in children when they go completely berserk after eating sugar, because all of their muscles are trying to use up the sugar and there's lots of movement and lots of energy. As adults, we've learned to sit still and behave ourselves very nicely, So what happens instead is this. First it says, well, how can I get some of that glucose out? And it says, well, I'm going to try and store it. And this is where that glucose then gets stored as fat inside the body. Right now in the UK, more than 60% of the adult population is overweight, obese, and it's largely because of the consumption of carbohydrates that are high in starch and sugars and don't have any fibre in or much fibre in at all, and then the overconsumption of the starch and the sugars. The body doesn't want to store it as fat, it's just in the short term, this is really dangerous to have this high blood sugar level. So it tries to get that sugar out, stores it as fat, and hopes it can deal with that fat later. Sometimes that fat stores around the organs, and then that can lead to some real damage and risk, especially things like fatty liver disease and cardiac issues around the heart. The body can also do something called glycation. Glycation is where the body takes a molecule of glucose and it's like, where can I put this? And it's like, well, I'll just put it here, or I'll just put it there just to get it out of the blood. This can cause advanced aging in the body. So the body does not want to store the fat or do this glycation process, but it's doing its best with what it's got to survive in the moment. So within 30 minutes, an hour, kind of a maximum hour and a half, 2 hours, this panic is then over because it gets all the glucose out, and we end up sometimes with actually a lower level of glucose than even when we started here, because the body didn't know how long this was going to go on for, so it clears it all out, and then we end up with a low sugar level, a low level of energy available to the body. And this is when we might feel a bit of an energy crash, a bit of a slump. We might get very strong cravings at this point, and it can lead to a real cycle then of this happening again. Now, if you notice here, we've only talked about a wheat cracker and a rye cracker. We haven't even been talking about things like sweets or cakes or things with loads of added sugars in. The more sugar and the more starch in a product, the worse this situation is, and the worse the crash and the slump is, and the worse the craving is. So what we can do in a really simple way is bring more fibre into our meals and into our snacks. When we bring in more fibre, it changes the way that these things digest and supports the entirety of the digestive system, and then naturally reduces things like cravings. So we're starting to understand now that the important thing about carbohydrates is having a good amount of fibre. So the question can be, what is it we need each day to really sustain ourselves well? And how is it we can utilise this information in a simple way to find out, is what I'm purchasing going to give me, a sugar crash and storage of fat and the things I don't want? Or is it going to leave me feeling full, satisfied and able to concentrate and energised long into my day? So let's have a little look at this. What does our body need? Now, if the body could choose, what it would have would be 2 different whole grains each day. And it doesn't actually need much more than that. And if we can get a greater variety of whole grains, so we're eating a selection across the week, then the body's going to be getting a variety of nutrients as well. Whole grains don't just give us energy, they also give us micronutrients and minerals that really support the body's health. The whole grains I have on a regular basis include things like rye, rice, corn, buckwheat. Other ones you might come across include things like spelt, quinoa, millet. There's a whole range of different grains that you might be able to already be familiar with or want to experiment and play with as well. So ideally the body's having 2 different whole grains each day, and the body actually doesn't have any need for the refined sugars or the starches or the flours or the things that come in the refined products. However, I'm not expecting that from watching this one video that you're like, and I never ate flour or sugar or syrups again, you know. We're coming to this from a really pragmatic place of how is it we're able to understand the body, understand food, and navigate this food culture in a really empowered way. So knowing what the body needs is a really essential part. And then being able to find out, okay, well, if I am choosing something that came in a packet or is pre-made or is, you know, made from a flour, made from one of these things, what is it actually doing in the body? So here we have our wonderful thing called the fiber test. The fiber test is to be done on products created by people. It is not for doing on fruits or vegetables or even the whole grains. This is trying to find out the question of, will it cause me a sugar spike in my blood and therefore lead to the fat storage and the risk and the damage to our organs? Or is it going to be leaving me feeling full and satisfied? Now, the wonderful thing is, if we find that there is a product that does give us a sugar spike, we can either then enact our empowered choice and swap it for something else, or we could do something that I call fiber boosting. And that is where you add something that's high in fiber to bring more fiber into the whole meal. So it doesn't matter about the different constituent parts of the meal, it's how much fiber is in the meal overall. Some fantastic things to fiber boost with include things like nuts, seeds, and veggies. Each of these have a really good amount of fibre in that support the body in its natural, effective digestive process. So let's bring on the fibre test. The way we do the fibre test is that we need to look at 2 bits of information on the nutrition label. And the fibre test is for comparison. We're not saying, is this product good or is this product bad? We're saying, compared between this and this, my best choice in this moment right now is this one. So we're finding out what can work for us in that moment. So it's for comparison. So because it's for comparison, we always look at the 100-gram section of the packet, because then we can compare different things. So I have got here a packet for some rye crackers. They're the ones that are from Aldi, but they're a good example of a general rye cracker. And then I've got a Tesco's ciabatta roll from the bakery section. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the 100-gram section of the nutrition label for both of these and find out, what does this do in my blood? Is this going to leave me full and satisfied, or is it going to cause a sugar spike and potentially harm my body? So what we want to look at is the total amount of carbohydrate, and we want to look at the fibre. And then we do a magical thing. We take the amount of fibre and we multiply it by 5. And we'll do a few examples of these. You can do it on your phone, you don't have to do it in your head. And I just do it roughly anyway, pretty loose with it. So I do the fibre multiplied by 5, and then I'm comparing this number to the total amount of carbohydrate. And what I ideally want is for the fibre times 5 to be close to, equal to, or above. If it is close, equal, or above, it means in my digestive tract, the fibre and the carb are in a good balance to allow me to feel full and satisfied. This was actually done in a fascinating study where they got a person to do 2 different things. First, they drank a glass of water that had sugar added into it, and then they monitored the blood sugar level afterwards. And what happened was this, as you'd expect, they started off with a normal blood sugar level. Then they had a massive sugar spike because all this sugar went straight into their blood. There's not much work for the stomach to do to have to break it down because it's just sugar in water, so no starch to break up. So they had the sugar spike. The body goes into panic and tries to get that out as quickly as possible, so converts it to fat, stores it elsewhere in the body, and then the sugar actually drops to lower than it was before, and the person experiences a sugar crash. This all happened in around 1 hour. Then they did a fascinating thing, and they got the person to have the exact same amount of water, the exact same amount of sugar, plus some blueberries. Now, blueberries are a fruit, so therefore they're very high in fibre, and they're especially high in fibre, blueberries, because of their skin. So they drink the water and they have the blueberries, and what they saw this time was that the sugar level starts off in the same place, and then the body starts to digest and receive sugar into the system, but it stays steady, 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 steady. I'm going a bit wobbly there, but it just stays steady, 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 and then comes down at the end of the digestive process. Because the blueberries contain fibre, they're like those, the security guard on the door of the nightclub, and it slows down the absorption of the sugar. So the sugars, even from just drinking sugar water, come slow and steady into the blood. So the body has a way of delivering it and taking it where it's needed and allowing us to have the healthy function of the body. What this study really showed us is that fibre is the difference that makes the difference. Now, for reasons that we'll come to shortly, I'm not advocating we have sugar water and balance it out with blueberries, but what we are noticing here is that with the presence of fibre, the body is able to behave in a much more natural way, supportive of all of our organs and as well as our mental and physical well-being. So this is why our fibre boosting really works, and this is where the multiplying by 5 came from. They found the perfect ratio of total carbohydrate and fibre. So let's have a little look here. So I've got my rye cracker label. So I'm looking at the 100 gram section, and it says carbohydrates, and here it says 69.3. So in my carbohydrates, I've got 69.3 grams. Now underneath it says of which sugars. That doesn't actually matter. The carbohydrate tells you the starch and the sugar. And as we know, starch behaves like sugar because it's just individual molecules of glucose. It's already sugar. So starch and sugar are the same after the stomach because the stomach breaks the starch down into sugars. So we look at the total amount of carb and we ignore the of which sugars. It does not matter. All the carbohydrate is sugar. So we've got a total carbohydrate, 69.3 grams. And then I come further down the label and it says fibre, 14.6 grams. So now I do my fibre test. I take my 14.6 and I times it by 5. I'm going to call that 15 roughly. So 15 times 5 is bringing me in around 75 grams. Roughly, approximately. So now I do my fibre test. I compare. Is 75 grams close, equal or above 69.3? Well, you know what? It's above. So this absolutely smashes the fibre test. What this is telling me is that when I eat these rye crackers, it's going to allow my body to digest them in a natural and useful way that leaves me feeling full and satisfied. So that's pretty useful. All we did was take the fibre, multiply it by 5 and compare it to the total carbohydrate. If it had been anywhere upwards of 60, I'd have been pretty happy with that as a fibre level. Now let's compare this to the ciabatta roll. So if I look at the total carbohydrate per 100 grams, it's 44.4. So I'm actually getting less energy, less fuel from 100 grams of the ciabatta roll. And then in the fibre, it is 2.7 grams. So we'll be really generous. We'll call it 3. 3 times 5 brings us to around 15 grams. Now let's do the fibre test. Let's compare. 15 compared to 44 grams is kind of nowhere near. It's nowhere near at all. So what this means is that this is actually going to cause a sugar spike in the body. This is going to cause a sugar spike, and it's going to lead to us actually feeling hungry again quite soon after. So now the question is, well, okay, could I swap it for something else? And this can be the fun foray into the supermarket of spending one of your shopping sessions having a look at the back of these packets. If you do online shopping, you can read the nutrition label there as well, and it's even easier to see. If you're looking at a nutrition label and it's hard to read, you can take a photograph on a smartphone and zoom in, and that's like having an automatic magnifying glass with you, which is very useful. So this roll is going to give a sugar spike, lead to fat storage, and then leave us feeling hungry within an hour. So this is where empowered choice is coming in. It doesn't mean that these are bad or these are not allowed or you're never allowed to have them or they're not a good thing to do, you know. What we're saying is this how I want to feel in an hour? Is this the most useful thing for me to eat right now? So we might swap it for a rye cracker. We might find a seeded bread. We might find a dark roll instead as a swap. Or we could fiber boost it. It's like, okay, so the ciabatta's all I've got right now. What can I add to it? You know, could I have some nuts and seeds alongside my lunch? Could I put on it something like hummus? Hummus is made of beans, and beans are incredibly high in fiber. So anything with beans in is going to boost your fiber as well. So this is empowered choice. This is the idea of, okay, well, what could I swap? What could I add in? What could I discover that supports me to feel really good in my relationship with food and especially with carbohydrates? On discovering the fiber test, many people say to me, well, what about fruit? Do I need to fiber test the fruit? I've heard fruit's bad. I heard fruit has lots of sugar in it. I heard that fruit could maybe, contribute to weight gain. I don't know if anyone else gets those little adverts on the side of the computer screen. The top 10 fruits to cut out now. And it's like, okay, let's find out what's true about fruit. So there is a specific sugar found inside fruit called fructose. It literally means fruit, that's the fruct, and the ose means sugar. Fructose takes a different journey through the body and the digestive tract. So let's have a little look. Say we eat a piece of fruit, comes down the esophagus and into the stomach, and from the stomach goes to the intestinal tract. And the intestinal tract, as we know, wants to pass nutrients into the blood. Now, the first place that the blood goes to is to our liver. The liver is a completely incredible organ, and it's so useful and vital for the body that it actually has its own fuel source and its own, what I think of as a backup generator, an ability to store extra fuel. The fuel of the liver is in fact fructose, the sugars that come from fruit, and it has the ability to store in its backup generator 2,000 calories of fructose. So we really are built to eat fruit. It's really, really important to our liver. Now, there's two different ways in which we can eat fruit, as we mentioned before. We can eat fruit as a piece of fruit, and that could be whether it's whole, frozen, dried, however it is. Or we can eat fruit where it's been processed, where it's been turned into juice, or it's been refined. This juice could be in the form of like fruit juice that we buy in a carton, or it could be like an ingredient. Often things, especially products marketed at children, will say sugar-free, sweetened naturally with fruit juice. Fruit juice is still just sugar. It's just sugar water. So let's see what happens in the body when we have these different forms of fruit in the whole, frozen or dried form, or maybe even like in a smoothie. A smoothie is still the whole fruit. It's just already been chewed up for you, essentially. Still incredibly good for the body. In fact, there's quite a bit of research showing that when we blend foods as soup or hummus or as smoothies, then we're actually more able to digest some of the nutrients because it's been chewed up so well. The blender does more chewing than our jaw can do, so it can be really useful. What happens that leads fruit sugars to potentially be causing problems in the body? Well, it looks a bit like this. It's all to do with the backup generator. If I have myself a lovely little apple, then I'm going to be eating, depending on the size of the apple, but approximately 40 calories of fructose in my apple. So if you imagine that I eat an apple and I put in 40 calories of fructose, this hardly makes a dent on my 2,000 calories. And that 40 calories is something that I can use throughout the day. So when I eat an apple, I'm giving myself a natural, healthy amount of supportive fructose for my body. Say, on the other hand, I was to drink some apple juice. Apple juice could have anything from 100 to 200 calories of fructose in it. So if you imagine something like a pint of cider, I'm based in Somerset, there's lots of pints of cider this way, and in a pint of cider you could be having 200 to 250 calories of fructose. So this is a very different calorific load coming into the body, and it will have a very different impact on the way that our liver is functioning. If we are having more refined fructose in this higher calorie dose, then we can very easily overwhelm the liver. If the liver is overwhelmed and then the storage is full, it's very easy for these high calorific fructose loads to overwhelm the liver, to make the storage full, and therefore this fructose instead has to be converted to fat. In this specific case, it is fat that specifically sits inside the liver and leads to fatty liver disease. Fatty liver disease is one of the top 5 killers in this country right now. It's a really, really high risk problem, but it's not happening because we're eating fruit. There was a study in fact done where they got people to eat 40 portions of veg and 20 portions of fruit every single day to try to find out what happens in the body when we eat this huge amount of vegetables and fruit. And what they found was that aside from the largest stool sample on record, people got healthier, people felt well, people's cholesterol dropped. It didn't cause any kind of negative impact for the liver. So we can handle large amounts of fruit in these whole food forms. However, it's when we're having fructose, the refined fruits, the extracted juices, that then we're causing things like fatty liver disease. The fantastic thing is that our body is actually able to repair this kind of damage. So if you know someone or you yourself have a high amount of fat around your liver or a lot of fat around the organs of your body, one of the best things you can do is become aware of where the refined sugars come in and find alternatives. It's like, what can we swap to instead? And this is where actually eating more fruit can be really useful. If there's one thing you are to take from this course, I would love it for that when you eat fruit, you can sit there delighting in how nourishing it is for you, how good it is for you, and how much it delights the body. I've had a few people say to me in their journey of recovering from binge eating disorder or overeating disorder, they say, yeah, but if I eat the grapes, I'll eat the whole bag. You know, say we're choosing between eating biscuits or eating a whole punnet of grapes. I'm not advocating for overeating, but the whole punnet of grapes is going to do far less damage to the body and actually more good to the body. As this study showed, 20 portions of fruit is a lot of fruit, and it added to people's health and well-being. So if you're eating fruit, enjoy it, relax, try and choose a wide variety of it, and trust that on the journey to improving and empowering your well-being, eating a little bit too much fruit is definitely the least bad thing that you could possibly do. So bringing in some compassion there, bringing in some space, and give yourself a little smile, knowing that every time you're eating fruit, you're doing a wonderful, wonderful thing for your entire body and your entire well-being. So as we talk about carbohydrates, it's really important to mention low-carb diets. So there are many, many different low-carb diets, and that can include things like Atkins, can include things like paleo, can include things like keto. And this is just to give a little overview of some of the research into these low-carb diets. They're often advertised and celebrated for their ability to support weight loss. Now, for many people, the relationship with carbohydrates can be quite challenging because carbohydrates often contain a lot of sugar. We can often have an emotional relationship with them because of how they respond in the brain. So when a person goes on a low carb or a no carb diet, then they have this rule that they're not allowed to have the carbs anymore. And for some, that can make it easier because they just cut out all carbohydrates rather than having any confusion or any doubt about it. And then it is possible for a person to lose weight because you take all the carbohydrates away and then your body is starting to use some of the stored fat. useful. However, the weight loss is often completely unsustainable. So a person is able to work with this diet for a particular amount of time, but it's unsustainable in our culture and it doesn't make people feel good. So they often then return to the same weight as before. But the most important thing to me is, does it make us more nourished? Are we actually healthier from having a low carb diet? And the answer is no. We fundamentally need the micronutrients and minerals that come in along with the whole grains. And the body's fuel source of preference is the glucose that comes through the starch inside the grains. So what we really want to be doing is supporting our body to have this easy access to energy. When we go on a low carb diet, the body goes into survival mode. So it is possible, but the body doesn't like it. A great example of this is actually the keto diet. So in children that have epilepsy is when there is a surge of overactivity in the brain and leads to somebody having an epileptic fit. In some cases, especially in children, the medication given for epilepsy isn't safe for them to have. So there was a trial done where they said, okay, well, if the brain has overactivity and that's a risk to the person's body, then what we could do instead is restrict the fuel to the brain so that there's less chance of there being an overactivity. This is where keto was born, because their brain went into something called ketosis, where it was using fats and proteins rather than using carbohydrates and glucose to fuel the brain. Now, ketosis was very effective for people who had this particular brain condition, but it was not recommended or ever suggested to be a diet of which people could, there's all kinds of magazines about it and books about it and special keto bars and all this kind of stuff. This is one tiny example where we can see that the surge and urge for weight loss can bring some, really fundamentally strange things into the public eye without the true question of, does this make us more nourished? Does this add to our health? What we see in the short term of people who go on no and low carb diets is actually low and irregular mood, because the brain isn't able to respond in the way that it would. The brain is not thriving, it's in survival mode. We also start to see people having some digestive discomfort. And this is largely to do with the fact that maybe fibre isn't as present in the diet because a person isn't having as many carbohydrates, which for some of the diets even involve things like carrots and broccoli and things. In the long term, there's much higher levels of things like depression and anxiety, all to do with the brain chemistry and the way the brain is in survival mode rather than in thrival mode. And then on the other side, what we start seeing is intestinal issues, and this can include an increased risk of cancers as well. The final thing that we see is actually people having muscle atrophy. So they have actually less muscle mass over time because the body isn't receiving the fuel that it really needs. So some of this weight loss is actually to do with lack of muscle. In large studies done with athletes on a keto diet, what they also track is a reduced performance as well, when it comes down to the muscle being able to perform as well. So this question of low carb diets, can they help you lose weight? Probably in the short term. Do they help you have a more nourished life and body and sustain and support you to feel really good? The answer is probably not. What we're looking for here is to try to build a nourishing and healthy, supportive relationship with carbohydrates, which involves having ideally 2 whole grains a day. And where we're choosing to have different products as our carbohydrates, we've now got the fibre test under our belt to support us to be able to navigate that interesting way that they advertise all the different foods. Some things on the front of the packet will say things like high fibre. To make something high fibre, it only has to have 6 grams of fibre per 100 gram. So you can make something with 94 grams of sugar and 6 grams of fibre, and it would still be classed as a high fibre product. So rather than being confused or manipulated by any of the stuff on the front of the packets or any of the fad diety things, we can now just flip the packet over, have a look, do the fibre test and understand, Is this going to cause me a sugar spike? Or is this going to support me to feel full and nourished and energized? And then we can make an empowered choice as best suits us in that moment on that day for us. When it comes to carbohydrates, so many of us use them when we're maybe not feeling so good, or maybe feel a bit down, or it can be one of the foods that we find most challenging to be able to have a nourishing and healthful relationship. And we have to ask, well, why is that? And it's all to do with the way that carbohydrates impact our brain. So within our brain, we have different neurochemicals. And that just means that we have different chemicals happening in the neurons, in the nerves of our brain, that give us different signals. And these signals have a large connection with our mood and how we feel. One of these neurochemicals is something called dopamine. Now, our body is incredibly intelligent and is really built to help us to survive. And one of the ways we can see this is that if you imagine your sense organs, your nose and your mouth, if I was to offer you some food that I've made a few days ago and it had been in the fridge, but I'm not so sure about it, and I would say, is this still good to eat? Probably the first thing you would do is maybe look at it and then maybe smell it. And then after smelling it, maybe tasting it. And you would know straight away whether or not that was something that was actually good to eat or not, simply by smelling it and tasting it. Because we have this inbuilt understanding of, okay, is this going to cause me harm, or is this going to be a good thing for me to eat? Now, a further development on this is the taste buds and the sense that we have within our mouth. So when we eat something, the body is noticing, is this useful for me? First it says, is this safe? And then it's saying, is this useful for me? And the body really wants things that are sweet and starchy. Why does the body want things that are sweet and starchy? Because they contain nutrients and they contain the fuel that the body needs in order to function. So if you go back pre-supermarkets, pre-processed food, finding sweet and starchy food was the thing that would allow us to survive and have the potential to thrive. So these things were really important. In the world pre-supermarkets and processed food, this meant sweet foods were fruits and the starchy foods were the grains. So fruits and grains gave us the capability to thrive. And in order for the body to communicate to us a signal to say, yes, 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 do this thing, let's have the thing that allows us to survive and thrive, when we eat the sweet and the starchy, when we sense that on the tongue, the body can release a little bit of this chemical, dopamine. And it is quite literally a reward. It's to say, yes, more of that. That is a good thing. Whatever that was, do that again. So we eat the fruit and we get a small natural little bit of dopamine. Or we eat the grains and we get a natural bit of dopamine. This is natural and good and supports the body. However, as you're probably starting to see where this is going, in our little society nowadays, sweet and starchy no longer means fruit and grains. It means things made from flour, things made from sugar, things made from syrups, things made from starch, like, crisps and, refined potato, as an example. Refined potato up there. And what happens instead is that the body was never really expecting to get these heavily, heavily refined grains and fruits and forms of sweet and starchy. And what happens in the body is that it responds in a very different way. So rather than there being a natural little perk of dopamine of, oh, that's a nice feeling, that's a good thing to do that again in the future, we get this excessive surge of dopamine, which the first time we experience it, we experience as pleasure. However, as we go on experiencing this, it becomes less and less pleasurable, and we actually become desensitized to the pleasure of it. And then we actually crave more of it. because we want more of it to feel that first time of pleasure. This is where we have some, and then we want more phenomenon coming in. This cycle of have some, want more is the very definition of addiction. And it all happens because of the relationship that these products make to dopamine in our brain. The most important thing to take away from this is to understand that wanting to feel pleasure is not bad. The fact that the body wants to feel, happy and energized and good, this is important. It's just that if we can only feel happy, energized and good by eating these food products that actually are not nutritious and potentially cause us harm, because these are all the things that are causing the sugar spike, leading to the risk of damage to our organs and leading to that excessive fat storage. We have to ask this question. Okay, it's great that I want to feel good. It is not bad that I want to feel good, but am I feeling good at what cost? At what cost to my short-term and my long-term health and well-being? Because the thing is, this doesn't take us anywhere. If we're feeling sad and then we eat the thing that caused us to feel sad in the world, whatever it is that's going on, hasn't actually changed. So once again, it's kind of like this pseudo way of feeling happy or feeling positive. So it's okay that we want this. It's just that, is this really the way that's going to take us there? And is this really the way that's going to support us? When it comes to supporting ourselves to change our relationship with dopamine, it can be really useful to experience having 3 days with no sugar. Now, you don't have to be hardcore about this. Say you're cooking with some tinned tomatoes and they've got a little bit of sugar on the ingredients list. That's not the major issue here. What we're finding out is, what will it be like in the body to go for 3 days with no sugar? And the kind of intention here is to bring an actual embodied awareness of our relationship with sugar. Do we notice that we get cravings? Because it's very easy for this just to feel normal and natural, that, it's okay to have this little pick-me-up. And we're not saying it's not okay, but the point is it a choice? Is it truly something that you're choosing? So by having 3 days being on a no or a low sugar diet, what we're thinking about here is the refined and the added sugars. So we're still eating and enjoying lots of fruit and lots of the naturally sweet things. We're just noticing things that are sweetened with sugars, things that are sweetened with syrups, things that are sweetened with honey. We're going to see what it's like to have an embodied awareness of having alternatives. What we see when we do this and what we experience is that our taste buds actually change their preference. And within 2 or 3 days, things that before might not have tasted that sweet suddenly become very, very hyper sweet. And some people experience that, things that are sweetened have a more chemically feel in the mouth, a more false or industrial kind of sense of the product, rather than it feeling like it did even 2 or 3 days ago, more like a food. It changes in their perception of how it interacts in their mouth. This 3 days of no sugar is there to help us to find out and to be curious about what actually happens in the body and how it makes us feel. You can't get it wrong. If you get into midday 2 and you have something with sugar in, you don't have to be like, oh no, I've failed, I've ruined it, Just let it go. It's like, fascinating. What is it we notice about, how easy it is to do, or where a craving was, or who's offering it to us, or where we find it, and how do we feel? Noticing how we feel is the most important part of this whole journey, to find out how you can empower yourself within your own relationship with food and your body. So your inspiration for this week ahead is to consider, where are you getting whole grains into your diet, and could it be possible for you to have 2 each day? I think I didn't mention it before, but oats are one of the whole grains as well, and they're an really easy one to get as well. Can we bring some conscious, empowered awareness to our relationship with sugar? Might we want to find things that we could swap to instead? So this can be a great place to have more fruit, or to be even using the fiber test to find alternatives. Can we be fiber boosting? Every time we add more fiber, we are supporting our body to have more energy and more intestinal tract well-being. And most importantly, giving ourselves the opportunity to use the empowered language of choice with things like today and I'm finding out, or saying no thank you, or saying yes please. Finding the simple ways of knowing what it is we want, what it is we want to experiment with, and what it is that feels good for us. So how do we gather what we've learned in this session into our lives in a really useful and empowering way? First is the deep acknowledgement of how important fibre is in supporting us to feel full and energised and able to focus and concentrate throughout our day and into our lives. The way we can do this is by 1, eating whole grains where we can. And if we are buying something that's made from a refined grain, maybe a bread, a flour, a pasta, something like that, then we can use our fibre test to support us to find out, is this going to give me the ability to focus and feel good? Or is it going to cause a sugar spike and a slump? When we have that piece of information, then we have a choice. Is there something I might want to swap to? Is there something I might want to discover instead? Or is there something I could add that would boost the fibre? So we're playing with this way of adding, swapping, and discovering. So it's not about what we can't have or shouldn't have or blah, blah, blah. We're stepping into this place of, how do I want to treat my body? What do I want to choose today? What is interesting for me? So we take our empowered language, we take our fibre test, and we take this out into the world, into our shopping, into our choices in a curious way. The invitation from this session is to experience what it's like to have 3 days without having any refined sugars. And we're just playing around with having more whole food snacks rather than having the overly sweetened and the things that can cause addictions and sugar spikes and cravings. The purpose of the 3 days is not to muscle your way through them being perfect and then on the 4th day have a binge. That's not what it's about. It's to find out, what is our relationship with sugar actually like? What happens with our food talk? What happens with our cravings? What happens with our mood? What happens with our evenings? What happens as we wake up in the morning? Noticing and connecting with the subtlety of ourself and finding out, do we feel better? A lot of people get to the end of those 3 days and realise that they're much more alert, they're much more able to concentrate, that they feel generally just more buoyant and less in the ups and downs and a bit more steady. It's there for you to play with and to experiment with. If at any point you're facing challenges, emotional challenges, patterns of maybe addictive behaviour, I am here for one-to-one support. I work in person and I work online. It's not meant to be that this course has got all the answers and that it's just easy, but it's definitely a great place to start this compassionate inquiry of tweaking and discovering what can really, really work for you. Thank you so much for joining. I hope it's been useful and I look forward to working together in the next session.